The timer showed 93 seconds when Staff Sergeant Riley Matthews first laid eyes on the device. Sweat dripped from her forehead onto the concrete floor of the abandoned warehouse in downtown Phoenix as she knelt beside what looked like a nightmare wrapped in duct tape and determination. The bomb squad radio crackled with urgent voices, but Riley had already tuned them out. Her commanding officers had spent months telling her she cracked under pressure, that she wasn't cut out for the elite explosive ordnance disposal unit. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Riley Matthews stood at attention in the sweltering heat of Fort Braxton, North Carolina, watching her dreams crumble with each word that came out of Colonel Harrison's mouth. The rejection letter felt heavier than her full combat gear as she clutched it in her trembling hands. "Matthews, I'm going to be straight with you," Colonel Harrison said, his weathered face showing no emotion. "Your technical scores are off the charts. Your written exams are perfect. But when it comes to high-pressure situations, you freeze. The Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit can't afford hesitation, not even for a split second." Riley had trained for 18 months to get into the EOD program. Every morning before dawn, she ran 10 miles through the muddy trails surrounding the base. She studied bomb schematics until her eyes burned, memorizing every wire configuration and detonation pattern known to military intelligence. She practiced on training devices until her fingers could identify components in complete darkness. But none of that mattered if she couldn't perform when it counted. The incident that sealed her fate had happened during a simulation exercise just 2 weeks prior. The scenario involved a suspected IED hidden beneath a mock checkpoint. Riley had approached the device with textbook precision, her movements methodical and careful. But when the timer hit 30 seconds, something inside her mind shifted. The sounds around her became muffled, her vision tunneled, and her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She had stepped back from the device, protocol be damned, and waited for the simulation to end. "Panic response," the evaluating officer had written in her file. "The subject demonstrates technical competence but lacks emotional stability under extreme pressure scenarios." Now, standing in Colonel Harrison's office with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, Riley felt that same crushing weight in her chest. But this time, instead of freezing, something else took over. A quiet determination that surprised even her. "Sir, with respect, I'd like to request a transfer to the 442nd Engineering Battalion in Arizona," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her head. "If I can't defuse bombs, I can at least build bridges." Colonel Harrison raised an eyebrow. Most rejected candidates either argued their case or left the military entirely. Riley was taking a different path, and he respected that. "Arizona's tough duty, Matthews. Desert conditions, long deployments, minimal support infrastructure. Are you sure about this?" "Yes, sir. I need to prove to myself that I can handle whatever the Army throws at me." 3 weeks later, Riley found herself stationed at Camp Meridian, a small forward operating base 40 miles outside Phoenix. The 442nd Engineering Battalion was responsible for maintaining critical infrastructure across the southwestern United States, from border security installations to emergency response support for civilian authorities. It wasn't glamorous work, but Riley threw herself into it with the same intensity she had once reserved for bomb disposal training. The desert was unforgiving. Temperatures regularly exceeded 115 degrees, and the terrain was littered with rattlesnakes, scorpions, and cacti that seemed designed specifically to shred military uniforms. Riley's first assignment involved rebuilding a communications tower that had been damaged in a flash flood. The work required precise engineering calculations and the ability to operate heavy machinery in conditions that would make most people seek air-conditioned shelter. Riley excelled. Her technical background from EOD training translated perfectly to engineering challenges. She could troubleshoot electrical systems, calculate load-bearing requirements for temporary bridges, and coordinate complex construction projects with military precision. More importantly, she began to rebuild her confidence. Each successful mission proved to her that the panic response in the simulation had been an aberration, not a defining characteristic. Her commanding officer in Arizona, Major Rebecca Stone, was a 20-year veteran who had served 3 tours in combat zones. Stone recognized talent when she saw it, and Riley's combination of technical expertise and work ethic impressed her immediately. "Matthews, I've been reviewing your file," Major Stone said during Riley's 6-week evaluation. They were standing beside a newly completed vehicle checkpoint that Riley had designed and built ahead of schedule. "Say you washed out of EOD training. Want to tell me what happened?" Riley had dreaded this conversation, but she owed her commanding officer honesty. "I froze during a pressure simulation, ma'am. Couldn't complete the exercise when the timer got low." Major Stone nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've seen a lot of soldiers crack under pressure. Most of them never recover. But you're different. You took that failure and used it as fuel. That tells me more about your character than any simulation ever could." Over the following months, Riley continued to prove herself. She led a team that rebuilt a crucial water treatment facility after an earthquake damaged the main supply lines to a border town. She designed a temporary airfield that allowed emergency medical helicopters to reach remote areas during a wildfire evacuation. Each success built upon the last, creating a foundation of confidence that had been missing during her EOD training.
But fate has a way of bringing people full circle. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Riley was reviewing blueprints for a new communications facility when Major Stone burst into the engineering office, her face grim with urgency. "Matthews, we have a situation in downtown Phoenix. Local police have evacuated a 6-block radius around a suspected explosive device in an abandoned warehouse. The Phoenix Bomb Squad is tied up with another incident on the other side of the city, and the FBI's nearest EOD team is 3 hours away." Riley felt her blood turn cold. "Ma'am, I'm not EOD certified anymore." "You're the closest thing we have to an explosives expert within 100 miles, Major Stone replied. "The device has a timer, and according to the initial assessment, it's sophisticated enough to cause massive structural damage to surrounding buildings. We need someone who can at least assess the situation until proper EOD support arrives." The drive to Phoenix took 45 minutes through desert highways that shimmered in the heat. Riley sat in the passenger seat of a military transport vehicle, her mind racing through everything she could remember from her EOD training. Wire colors, detonation patterns, common trigger mechanisms. The knowledge was still there, buried beneath months of bridge building and tower construction. When they arrived at the perimeter, the scene was controlled chaos. Police vehicles blocked every street leading to the warehouse district. News crews had already set up their cameras at the safe distance markers. FBI agents in tactical gear were coordinating with local authorities, their radios crackling with updates from the evacuation zone. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Phoenix field office met Riley at the command post. "Staff Sergeant Matthews, I understand you have explosives training." "Had, ma'am. I washed out of the program 6 months ago." Agent Chen studied Riley's face for a moment. "Well, you're what we have right now. The device is located on the 3rd floor of the warehouse at the center of the block. Initial reconnaissance shows it's a complex assembly with multiple components and what appears to be a digital countdown timer. We managed to get a drone close enough for visual confirmation before pulling back." She handed Riley a tablet displaying grainy footage from the drone camera. The device was exactly what Riley had feared. A sophisticated assembly that looked nothing like the training bombs she had practiced on months earlier. This was real, and it was designed to kill. "How much time?" Riley asked. Agent Chen checked her watch. "Timer showed 4 minutes and 37 seconds when we last had visual contact. That was 8 minutes ago." Riley's mouth went dry. Less than 4 minutes to assess a bomb she had never seen before, with skills she hadn't used in half a year, while knowing that failure would likely result in casualties and massive property damage. Every instinct told her to step back, to wait for the real experts, to avoid repeating the humiliation of her training failure. Instead, she found herself asking for the bomb suit. "Matthews, you don't have to do this," Major Stone said quietly. "No one expects you to." Riley was already checking the equipment, her hands moving with muscle memory that surprised her. The bomb suit was heavier than she remembered, and the helmet's visor seemed to narrow her field of vision more than during training. But everything else felt familiar. The weight of the tools, the systematic approach to unknown threats, the careful balance between speed and precision. "Actually, ma'am, I think I do have to do this." The walk to the warehouse felt like crossing into another dimension. The normally busy Phoenix streets were empty except for abandoned cars and the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Riley's breathing echoed inside the bomb suit helmet as she climbed the concrete stairs to the third floor, each step bringing her closer to a moment that would define the rest of her military career. The warehouse's third floor reeked of motor oil and decades of industrial neglect. Broken windows cast jagged shadows across the concrete floor, and Riley's footsteps echoed in the cavernous space as she approached the device. Through the bomb suit's visor, everything looked slightly distorted, like viewing the world through thick glass underwater. The bomb sat in the center of the room like a mechanical spider. Its components spread across a wooden pallet in a configuration that immediately told Riley this wasn't the work of an amateur. Multiple cylindrical objects were connected by a web of colored wires that led to a central digital display. The red numbers glowed ominously in the dim light. 0247. 2 minutes and 47 seconds? Riley activated her helmet radio. "Command, I have a visual on the device. Multiple components, digital timer, complex wire assembly. This is definitely not a training exercise." Agent Chen's voice crackled through the speaker. "Copy that, Matthews. Can you identify the explosive type?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Riley knelt beside the device, her hands surprisingly steady as she examined the cylindrical components. The casings were smooth aluminum, unmarked except for small serial numbers etched near the bases. Professional-grade materials, not the improvised explosives typically used by domestic terrorists. "Looks like military-grade plastic explosive, possibly C4 based on the casing design. Approximately 12 pounds total yield." Riley paused as she noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Command, there's a secondary trigger mechanism. This isn't just a timer bomb, it's got a motion sensor backup." The implications hit everyone on the radio channel simultaneously. If the timer failed or was somehow disabled, any significant movement near the device would trigger detonation. Riley was trapped in a deadly catch-22. She couldn't leave without risking accidental detonation, and she couldn't stay without running out of time. "Matthews, new information from our database," Agent Chen transmitted. "We've identified similar devices used by Viktor Kozlov, former military demolitions expert turned mercenary. His bombs typically have 3-stage failsafes: timer, motion sensor, and tamper detection on the main circuit board." Riley felt sweat pooling inside the bomb suit despite the warehouse's air conditioning. Kozlov's reputation was legendary in military explosive circles. His devices were elegant death traps that punished any attempt at disarmament. The fact that his work had appeared in Phoenix meant someone with serious resources wanted to send a very dramatic message. 0218. The timer continued its relentless countdown as Riley studied the wire configuration. Traditional bomb disposal training taught a systematic approach: identify the power source, trace the primary circuit, locate the detonation trigger, and find the safest disarmament point. But Kozlov's devices were designed to punish systematic thinking. Riley's radio crackled again. "Matthews, FBI database shows Kozlov's devices typically use color-coded wires as decoys. The actual disarmament sequence involves following the power flow rather than wire colors."
Understood, but I need better lighting to trace the circuits properly. Negative on additional lighting, Matthews. Kozlov sometimes incorporates photosensitive triggers. Any sudden change in ambient light could set off the device. Riley closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back the familiar sensation of walls closing in around her. This was exactly the kind of impossible situation that had caused her to freeze during training. Multiple variables, deadly consequences, and no clear path to success. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, call for help, wait for someone more qualified. Instead, she opened her eyes and began following the power lines. The main battery pack was hidden beneath the wooden pallet, connected to the timing mechanism through a series of relay switches that formed a maze of redundant pathways. Riley realized that disabling the timer wouldn't stop the bomb. It would simply transfer control to the motion sensor system. The only way to truly disarm the device was to cut power to all systems simultaneously. 0152. Command, I need you to clear all aircraft from the immediate area. If this thing goes off, I don't want any helicopters caught in the blast radius. Matthews, that includes the medical evacuation helicopters standing by for you. I understand. Clear them out anyway. Riley's hands moved with increasing confidence as she traced each circuit pathway. The motion sensor was connected to the main power supply through a separate relay that could be accessed from underneath the device. The tamper detection system ran on its own battery backup, but it was designed to monitor the primary circuits rather than the power source. She pulled out her wire cutters and positioned them carefully around the main power cable. The cut would have to be perfect. Too slow, and the tamper detection system would register the power fluctuation and detonate the bomb. Too fast, and the sudden loss of power might trigger a failsafe she hadn't identified yet. 0119. Matthews, Phoenix EOD team just arrived at the perimeter. They're suiting up now, but it'll take them at least 3 minutes to reach your location. Copy that, but I'm not sure we have 3 minutes. Riley wiped condensation from her visor and studied the timing mechanism more closely. The digital display was connected to the main circuit board through a ribbon cable that looked almost too simple compared to the complexity of the rest of the device. Then she saw it, a tiny LED light hidden behind the timer display, blinking in a pattern that didn't match the countdown sequence. The light was connected to a separate circuit that ran directly to one of the explosive charges. Kozlov's signature trick, a completely independent detonation system disguised as a status indicator. 0108. Riley's mind raced through the implications. The LED system was probably counting down on its own schedule, independent of the main timer. Even if she successfully disarmed the primary bomb, the secondary system would detonate the device within minutes. She needed to disable both systems simultaneously, which meant coordinating cuts on multiple circuits while avoiding the motion sensors. Command, I'm going to need you to create a distraction outside the building, something loud enough to mask any sounds I might make up here. What kind of distraction? Fire truck air horns, construction equipment, anything that creates consistent noise cover. 0101. The sound of diesel engines roaring to life filtered up from the street below as the emergency response teams coordinated their distraction. Riley used the noise cover to reposition herself closer to the device, moving slowly to avoid triggering the motion sensors while gaining access to the hidden circuit panel she had identified behind the main timer assembly. The panel was secured with screws that had been painted over to make them less visible. Riley used a multi-tool to carefully remove each screw, her movements precise despite the bulk of the bomb suit gloves. Inside the panel, she found exactly what she had expected, a second timing mechanism running on its own battery, counting down independently of the main display. The secondary timer showed 43 seconds, 4 seconds behind the main display. Riley realized she had stumbled onto Kozlov's masterstroke. Even if someone managed to disarm the primary bomb with seconds to spare, the secondary system would detonate the device before they could escape the blast radius. She positioned wire cutters on both the primary power cable and the secondary system's battery leads. The cuts would have to be simultaneous, which meant coordinating her hand movements while working in heavy protective gloves with limited visibility. Riley took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and made the cuts in a single coordinated motion. The main timer display went dark immediately, but the LED behind it continued blinking. The secondary system was still active. Something was wrong. She had cut the battery leads, but the secondary circuit was still receiving power from somewhere else. Riley frantically traced the wires and discovered a third power source she had missed, a small lithium cell hidden inside the wooden pallet itself. Her hands moved faster now, driven by desperation rather than careful technique. She pried at the wooden planks with her multi-tool, searching for the hidden battery compartment while fighting against the bomb suit's limited mobility. Splinters of wood scattered across the floor as she tore into the pallet. There, a small rectangular battery pack nestled between two boards, connected to the LED system by wires so thin they were barely visible. Riley positioned her cutters around the final power cable, but hesitated as she noticed one last detail that stopped her cold. The battery pack had its own tamper detection strip running along the edge. If she cut the wrong wire first, or if her cutters touched the metal casing, the entire device would detonate instantly. Riley closed her eyes and visualized the circuit diagram she had built in her mind. The tamper strip was designed to detect physical disturbance, not electrical interruption. If she could cut the power wires without touching the battery casing, the system should shut down cleanly. She opened her eyes, positioned the cutters with surgical precision, and made the final cut. The LED stopped blinking. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of diesel engines and Riley's own rapid breathing inside the bomb suit helmet. She stared at the device for several long seconds, waiting for some sign that it was truly disarmed. Nothing happened. Command: device appears to be neutralized. All timers display dark, no visible activity on any circuits. The radio erupted in cheers and congratulations, but Riley barely heard them. She was already backing away from the device, moving slowly to avoid any chance of triggering a failsafe she might have missed. Each step toward the staircase felt like a small victory, and by the time she reached the warehouse entrance, her legs were shaking from adrenaline rather than fear. Agent Chen was waiting at the perimeter with the biggest smile Riley had ever seen on a federal agent's face. "Matthews, that was textbook perfect. How did you know about the secondary and tertiary systems?" Riley pulled off the bomb suit helmet and felt cool air hit her sweat-soaked face. "Honestly, I didn't know for certain. I just kept following the logic of the circuits until I ran out of wires to cut." What she didn't say was that somewhere during those final 90 seconds, the crushing pressure that had paralyzed her during training had transformed into something else entirely. A crystal-clear focus that allowed her to see solutions instead of problems, possibilities instead of obstacles. She had found her moment, and it had lasted exactly 90 seconds. The Phoenix Police Department's downtown headquarters buzzed with activity as news of the successful bomb disarmament spread through law enforcement channels. Riley found herself in an interrogation room that had been hastily converted into a debriefing center, facing a panel of officials who seemed more interested in understanding what had just happened than in celebrating the victory. Agent Chen sat across from Riley with a digital recorder and a stack of files that looked thick enough to contain the entire history of domestic terrorism. Beside her, Detective Marcus Rodriguez from Phoenix PD took handwritten notes, while Major Stone observed from a chair near the door, her expression unreadable. "Let's start from the beginning, Staff Sergeant," Agent Chen said, consulting her notes. "When you first approached the device, what made you suspect it wasn't a standard explosive assembly?" Riley accepted a bottle of water from Detective Rodriguez and took a long drink before responding. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving her feeling simultaneously exhausted and hyper-aware of every detail from the warehouse. The wire configuration was too clean. Most improvised devices have messy connections, twisted wires, electrical tape holding everything together. This looked like it had been assembled in a laboratory with proper tools and unlimited time. Agent Chen nodded and made notes. "Our preliminary analysis confirms your assessment. The device contained approximately 12 pounds of military-grade C4, professional detonators, and circuit boards manufactured in Eastern Europe. This wasn't some basement bomb maker." Detective Rodriguez looked up from his notepad. Any idea why someone would plant a device like this in an abandoned warehouse? The target doesn't make sense for terrorism or organized crime. Riley had been wondering the same thing during the drive back from the warehouse district. The location seemed random. No government facilities nearby, no high-value corporate targets, just empty industrial buildings and a few residential blocks that had seen better decades. Actually, Agent Chen said, opening one of her files, we think the warehouse was chosen specifically because it would force a response. The caller who reported the bomb was very specific about the timer display being visible and the device being sophisticated enough to require military expertise.
Major Stone spoke for the first time since they had entered the room. You're saying this was a test? We're saying someone wanted to see how local authorities would respond to a high-level explosive threat. They may have been studying our protocols, response times, and personnel assignments. Agent Chen pulled out a series of photographs showing the warehouse from different angles. The device was positioned to be clearly visible from multiple entry points, but in a location that would require someone to get close enough to examine it properly. Riley studied the photos and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. How did they know I would be the one to respond? The Phoenix bomb squad was supposed to handle this. That's what concerns us, Agent Chen replied. The anonymous tip came in 45 minutes after the Phoenix EOD team was dispatched to the other side of the city. Someone was monitoring emergency frequencies and knew exactly when to make the call. Detective Rodriguez tapped his pen against the table. What was the other incident that tied up the bomb squad? Agent Chen hesitated before answering. A suspicious package at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport turned out to be a false alarm. Airport security found a backpack with wires sticking out of it near Terminal 4. The EOD team spent 3 hours determining it was actually a broken electronic device that someone had abandoned. The implications settled over the room like smoke. Someone had orchestrated both incidents to ensure that Riley would be the only available explosives expert when the warehouse bomb was discovered. But that raised an even more disturbing question. How did they know about Riley's background? Agent Chen, Riley said slowly, how many people outside the military would know about my EOD training and subsequent assignment to Arizona? That's what we're trying to figure out. Your military records are classified, but information has a way of finding its way to the wrong people. Agent Chen pulled out another file, this one marked with security clearance warnings. Viktor Kozlov, the bomb maker whose signature we identified on the device, has been linked to at least 6 attacks on military personnel over the past 2 years. The file contained surveillance photos of a man in his late 40s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of hard living. Kozlov had been a demolitions expert in the Russian military before going freelance, selling his expertise to the highest bidder, regardless of their politics or intentions. His targets aren't random, Agent Chen continued. He specifically goes after military explosives experts, almost like he's collecting scalps. 3 bomb technicians were killed in Germany, 1 in South Korea, 2 in Iraq. All of them were considered among the best in their field. Riley felt her mouth go dry. You think he was targeting me specifically? We think you were being evaluated. The device you disarmed was designed to test your capabilities under pressure, not necessarily to kill you, at least not immediately. Major Stone leaned forward in her chair. Explain that. Agent Chen opened the file wider, revealing technical diagrams that looked like they belonged in a military engineering manual. Our analysis of the device shows that while it contained enough explosive to level the warehouse, the timer and failsafe systems were calibrated to give an experienced technician just enough time to disarm them. It was a puzzle, not an execution. Detective Rodriguez frowned. That doesn't make sense. Why go to all that trouble just to test someone? Because Kozlov is recruiting, Agent Chen said. Intelligence suggests he's building a team of explosives experts for a major operation somewhere in the United States. He's been systematically identifying and testing military EOD personnel, looking for people with the skills and psychological profile he needs. Riley stared at the photographs of Kozlov's previous targets, all of them military personnel with specialized training in explosive ordnance disposal. 3 of the victims had been women, 2 had served in combat zones. All of them had exemplary service records before their encounters with Kozlov's devices. "So what happens now?" Riley asked. Agent Chen closed the files and fixed Riley with a steady gaze. "Now you have a choice. We can put you in protective custody, transfer you to a secure location, and hope that Kozlov loses interest and moves on to other targets. Or we can use you as bait to draw him out and stop him before he kills anyone else." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Riley looked at Major Stone, who maintained her neutral expression but gave an almost imperceptible nod. The decision was Riley's to make, but her commanding officer was signaling that she would support whatever choice Riley made. What would using me as bait involve? Agent Chen opened a different file, this one containing what looked like operational planning documents. "We would stage another scenario, this time with full surveillance and tactical support in place. Kozlov would be given information suggesting that you're investigating his previous work, making you an irresistible target for his next test. When he makes his move, we'll be ready." Detective Rodriguez shook his head. "That's asking Staff Sergeant Matthews to walk into a trap designed by someone who's already killed 6 people. It's asking her to walk into a trap that we've designed to look like his trap," Agent Chen corrected. "The difference is that this time we control all the variables." Riley stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Phoenix skyline. The warehouse district was visible in the distance, a cluster of industrial buildings that look harmless in the afternoon sunlight. 6 hours ago, she had been reviewing construction blueprints and worrying about bridge specifications. Now she was being asked to deliberately put herself in the crosshairs of an international killer. But there was something else to consider. Kozlov's previous targets hadn't been given a choice. They had been ambushed, tested, and killed without warning. Riley had survived his test, which meant she understood his methods better than anyone else currently available to law enforcement. "How long would it take to set up this operation?" she asked.
2 weeks, maybe 3. We need time to establish the proper surveillance network and get our tactical teams in position. Riley thought about the 6 dead explosives experts in Kozlov's file, all of them people who had dedicated their careers to protecting others from the very kind of devices he specialized in building. They had been soldiers, like her, trained to face impossible odds in service of something larger than themselves. She turned back to face the panel. What kind of support would I have? Agent Chen smiled for the first time since the debriefing had begun. Full FBI tactical support, military backup from your unit, and surveillance technology that would make the NSA jealous. Plus, you'd have something none of Kozlov's previous targets had, which is advance warning. You know he's coming, you know how he operates, and you know you can beat his devices under pressure. Major Stone finally spoke again. "Matthews, you don't have to make this decision today. Take some time to think about it." Riley shook her head. "Actually, ma'am, I think I do need to decide today. The longer we wait, the more time Kozlov has to identify other targets. If I can help stop him, then that's what I should do." She looked around the room at the faces of people who had spent their careers dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. Agent Chen had probably seen more death and destruction than most combat veterans. Detective Rodriguez had likely worked hundreds of cases involving people who hurt others for money or pleasure. Major Stone had commanded soldiers in situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. But none of them were being asked to voluntarily walk into a situation designed by a killer who had never been defeated. "I'll do it," Riley said, "but I have conditions." Agent Chen pulled out a fresh notepad. "Name them." "First, I want full tactical control over the scenario. If I'm going to be the target, I get to choose the battleground. Second, I want my engineering team from Camp Meridian involved in the planning. They know my capabilities and limitations better than anyone else. Third, if this goes wrong, I want guarantees that Kozlov won't be able to target other military personnel. Done, and we'll do our best on the third condition." Agent Chen closed her notepad. "Anything else?" Riley thought about her journey from the failed EOD candidate who had frozen during a training simulation to the soldier who had just disarmed a sophisticated bomb with seconds to spare. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But now she had the opportunity to use that hard-won growth to potentially save lives. Yeah, one more thing. I want to understand exactly how Kozlov identifies his targets. If he's been tracking military personnel, there might be others who are already in danger. Agent Chen nodded approvingly. That's actually the first phase of our operation. We're going to trace his intelligence network and identify anyone else who might be at risk. Detective Rodriguez looked skeptical. And if you can't trace his network, then we'll make sure he's too focused on Staff Sergeant Matthews to threaten anyone else. Riley felt a familiar weight settling in her chest, but this time it wasn't the crushing pressure of panic. It was the steady, purposeful weight of responsibility. She had spent months proving to herself that she could handle whatever challenges the Army threw at her. Now she was about to face a challenge that went far beyond anything in military training manuals. "When do we start?" she asked. Agent Chen checked her watch. "The planning phase begins tomorrow morning at 800. We'll be setting up a joint task force with the FBI, military intelligence, and local law enforcement. You'll be briefed on everything we know about Kozlov's methods, his previous operations, and our best guesses about what he's planning next. And then we give him exactly what he's looking for, a target too tempting to resist." As the debriefing concluded and the officials filed out of the room, Riley remained by the window, watching the sun set over Phoenix. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance, each one representing families going about their evening routines, unaware that somewhere in the darkness, a killer was planning his next move. But this time, his next move would lead him directly into a trap. Riley just hoped she would be strong enough to survive whatever test he had planned for her. The next morning would begin 2 weeks of the most intensive preparation of her military career, followed by what would likely be the most dangerous 90 seconds of her life. But tonight, she was going to sleep better than she had in months. For the first time since her EOD training failure, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The Joint Task Force headquarters occupied the entire 3rd floor of a nondescript office building in downtown Phoenix, its windows tinted black and its entrance guarded by agents who looked like they had stepped out of a federal law enforcement recruitment poster. Riley arrived at 0800 sharp, carrying a duffel bag filled with technical manuals and wearing the kind of military-issued tactical clothing that suggested she was ready for anything. The main briefing room looked like something from a spy thriller, wall-mounted monitors displaying surveillance footage, tactical maps, and what appeared to be real-time satellite imagery. Agent Chen stood at the head of a conference table surrounded by people Riley didn't recognize but who clearly belonged in rooms where life-and-death decisions were made on a daily basis. "Staff Sergeant Matthews, welcome to Operation Checkmate," Agent Chen said, gesturing to an empty chair near the front of the table. "Let me introduce you to the team." The introductions revealed the scope of what Riley had volunteered for. Special Agent David Park from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, whose job was to predict Kozlov's next move based on psychological profiling. Lieutenant Colonel James Washington from Army Intelligence, who had been tracking Kozlov's activities across 3 continents for the past 2 years. Detective Captain Lisa Torres from Phoenix PD, who would coordinate local law enforcement support. Dr. Sarah Kim from the Defense Intelligence Agency, whose expertise in explosive devices rivaled anything in the military. And finally, Captain Marcus Reed from the 75th Ranger Regiment, whose tactical team would provide security and backup during the operation. "The first thing you need to understand," Lieutenant Colonel Washington began, activating one of the wall monitors, "is that Viktor Kozlov isn't just a bomb maker. He's a strategist who thinks 3 moves ahead of everyone trying to catch him." The monitor displayed a timeline stretching back 18 months, marked with incidents across multiple countries. Each red dot represented one of Kozlov's attacks, with detailed information about the target, the device used, and the outcome.
Look at the pattern, Washington continued. He doesn't strike randomly. Each target was selected for specific skills, experience, or knowledge that he needed for something bigger. Riley studied the timeline, noting the geographical progression from Eastern Europe through the Middle East and finally to North America. He's moving towards something, building a team for a specific operation. Special Agent Park nodded approvingly. Exactly. Our psychological profile suggests he's planning a major attack that requires multiple specialists. The bomb you disarmed yesterday was his way of evaluating your technical skills and psychological profile under extreme pressure. Dr. Kim activated another monitor showing technical specifications for the warehouse device. His bombs are getting more sophisticated with each incident. The device you faced included innovations we hadn't seen in his previous work. Multiple independent power sources, advanced tamper detection, motion sensors calibrated to detect human movement patterns. He's learning from each encounter, Captain Reed observed, studying how his targets respond, refining his techniques, getting better at identifying people with the specific skills he needs. Riley felt a chill as the implications became clear. You're saying he's been collecting data on military explosives experts across multiple countries, testing them like lab rats. And now he wants to recruit you, Agent Chen said. Our intelligence suggests he's identified at least 12 potential targets in the United States, all of them current or former military EOD personnel with combat experience. Lieutenant Colonel Washington pulled up a new display showing photographs and service records. Riley recognized some of the faces from military publications and training conferences. These weren't random soldiers. These were among the most skilled explosives experts in the American military. The good news is that we've been able to warn most of them and put protective details in place. The bad news is that Kozlov knows we're onto him, which means he's going to accelerate his timeline. Detective Captain Torres leaned forward. How accelerated are we talking about? Intelligence intercepts suggest he's planning to make his move within the next 2 weeks, Agent Chen replied, which is why we need to get Operation Checkmate running immediately. Dr. Kim activated a 3-dimensional holographic display that showed a detailed recreation of an industrial facility. This is the Westfield Chemical Processing Plant, about 30 miles north of Phoenix. It's been abandoned for 5 years following environmental violations, but it still contains enough hazardous materials to create a significant disaster if someone knew how to weaponize them. Riley studied the holographic model, noting the facility's layout and the proximity to major population centers. You think that's his target? We think that's where he's going to test you next, Captain Reed said. Our plan is to stage a scenario that makes it look like you're investigating his previous work at the facility. We'll plant intelligence suggesting that he left behind evidence of his bomb-making techniques. Special Agent Park pulled out a thick folder containing what looked like psychological evaluation reports. Based on his previous behavior patterns, Kozlov won't be able to resist the opportunity to confront you directly. He's demonstrated a need to personally observe his targets during high-stress situations. So I'm going to be bait in a trap, but the trap is designed to look like I'm hunting him instead of the other way around, Riley summarized. Exactly. And unlike his previous targets, you'll have comprehensive backup and surveillance support. Agent Chen activated yet another monitor, this one showing a detailed schematic of the chemical processing facility overlaid with tactical positioning markers. Captain Reed's team will be positioned at strategic points around the facility perimeter. We'll have drone surveillance, thermal imaging, and communication jammers to prevent Kozlov from calling in outside support. Riley walked closer to the holographic model, studying the facility's internal layout. The main processing building was a maze of chemical tanks, pipe systems, and industrial equipment that would provide countless hiding places for explosive devices. The control room was elevated above the main floor, offering clear sight lines but also making it a potential trap. What makes you think he'll show up personally instead of just planting another remote device? Lieutenant Colonel Washington smiled grimly. Because this time, we're going to make him believe you figured out his pattern and are closing in on his location. Men like Kozlov have massive egos. They can't resist the opportunity to prove their superiority face to face. Dr. Kim pulled up technical specifications for various explosive compounds.
We've also prepared countermeasures for his most likely device configurations. Based on the warehouse bomb, we can predict several possible escalations in sophistication. The key, Captain Reed added, is that you won't be going in blind like his previous targets did. We know his methods, we know his psychology, and we have resources he's never faced before. Riley spent the next several hours reviewing every aspect of the operation. The tactical team would establish overwatch positions before dawn, using night vision and thermal imaging to monitor all approaches to the facility. Drone surveillance would provide real-time intelligence on any unusual activity within a 5-mile radius. Communication systems would allow instant coordination between all team members. But despite all the technology and planning, Riley would still be walking into a building with a killer who had never been caught and never been defeated. "There's one thing I don't understand," Riley said during a break in the briefing. "Why not just arrest him when he shows up? Why go through with whatever test he's planned?" Special Agent Park exchanged glances with Agent Chen before answering. "Because we need him alive and cooperative. Kozlov is part of a larger network that we're still trying to identify. If we arrest him prematurely, his associates will disappear, and we'll lose our only chance to stop whatever major operation they're planning."
Plus, Lieutenant Colonel Washington added, we need to understand his recruitment criteria. If we can figure out exactly what skills and psychological profiles he's looking for, we can identify and protect other potential targets. Dr. Kim activated a display showing chemical compound analyses. There's also the matter of his technical innovations. The warehouse device included explosive compounds and triggering mechanisms that represent significant advances in bomb-making technology. We need to understand how he's developing these innovations. Riley nodded, but privately wondered if the intelligence value was worth the risk. Kozlov had killed 6 explosives experts, each of them highly trained professionals who probably thought they understood what they were facing. What made the task force so confident that this time would be different? "When do we move?" she asked. "Tomorrow night," Agent Chen replied. "We'll stage your arrival at the facility during evening hours, when visibility is limited but not completely dark." Kozlov seems to prefer scenarios where his targets have to work under artificial lighting conditions. Captain Reed pulled up duty rosters and equipment lists. "My team will be in position by 1800 hours. You'll enter the facility at 2100, giving us time to establish full surveillance coverage and verify that the area is secure." "Define secure," Riley said. "No hostile personnel within the immediate perimeter, no signs of pre-planted explosive devices, clear communication channels, and confirmed backup support within 2 minutes of your location." Riley studied the faces around the conference table, noting the mixture of confidence and concern in their expressions. These were people who dealt with dangerous situations professionally, but even they seemed to understand that Operation Checkmate carried unusual risks. "What happens if something goes wrong?" she asked. "Multiple contingency plans," Agent Chen replied. "Immediate extraction if you're in physical danger, tactical intervention if Kozlov attempts to harm you, medical support standing by, and abort procedures if the situation becomes untenable. And if Kozlov doesn't show up, then we try a different approach," Lieutenant Colonel Washington said. "But our psychological profile suggests he will show up. The opportunity to directly confront someone who survived his previous test will be irresistible to him." Riley spent the rest of the day reviewing technical manuals, studying facility blueprints, and participating in tactical briefings with Captain Reed's team. The Rangers were professional and thorough, clearly experienced in high-risk operations, but Riley could see the concern in their eyes when they thought she wasn't looking. By evening, she felt as prepared as anyone could be for walking into a trap designed by an international killer. The equipment was state-of-the-art, the backup support was comprehensive, and the intelligence was more detailed than anything available to Kozlov's previous targets. But as she lay in her quarters that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Phoenix traffic outside, Riley couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Kozlov had stayed ahead of military and law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. Men like that didn't survive by falling for obvious traps, no matter how well planned. There was something about this operation that felt too neat, too confident, too much like the kind of scenario that looked perfect on paper but fell apart when it encountered the real world.
Riley closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow night would either end Kozlov's killing spree or add her name to the list of explosives experts who had underestimated him. Either way, she would finally know whether her transformation from failed EOD candidate to someone who could function under extreme pressure was real or just a lucky accident in a Phoenix warehouse. The next 18 hours would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the lives of every other military explosives expert in Kozlov's crosshairs. The Westfield chemical processing plant stood like a skeletal monument to industrial decay against the desert night sky. Riley approached the facility at exactly 2100 hours, her tactical gear equipped with enough surveillance technology to stock a spy movie, but feeling strangely exposed despite the comprehensive backup support surrounding her. The main gate hung open on rusted hinges, and her footsteps echoed off cracked concrete as she made her way toward the primary processing building. Through her earpiece, she could hear the steady chatter of Captain Reed's team confirming positions and reporting clear sightlines. Overwatch 1, target building secured, no movement detected. Drone surveillance shows all clear within 500 meters. Thermal imaging is negative for human signatures in the immediate area. Riley keyed her radio. Command, approaching the main entrance now. Everything looks exactly like the briefing materials. Copy that, checkmate. Maintain a standard approach. All teams report ready. The main building's entrance was secured with a chain and padlock that looked far too new for a facility that had been abandoned for 5 years. Riley examined the lock more closely and discovered it was a high-security model typically used by government facilities, not the kind of hardware that would be left behind by a bankrupt chemical company. Command, the entrance lock has been replaced recently. Someone's been maintaining access to this facility. Agent Chen's voice crackled through the earpiece. Understood. Proceed with caution, but continue the mission. Riley cut through the chain with bolt cutters from her gear pack and pushed open the heavy steel door. The interior of the facility was illuminated by emergency lighting that cast long shadows between massive chemical tanks and industrial equipment. The air smelled of rust, decay, and something chemical that made her eyes water despite her protective gear.
She moved methodically through the main floor, following the route that had been planned during the briefing. According to intelligence reports, Kozlov would most likely position his test device in the facility's control room, which offered elevated positioning and multiple escape routes. But as Riley climbed the metal staircase toward the control room, she noticed something that hadn't appeared in any of the surveillance photos: fresh tool marks on the handrails and new welding points where additional structural supports had been added. Command, someone has been modifying this facility. The control room access has been reinforced with new structural elements. Copy that. Continue to be objective, but be advised we're seeing increased electromagnetic interference on some monitoring frequencies. Riley reached the control room door and found it standing slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Her tactical flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating banks of control panels that should have been dead but were somehow displaying active readouts. The facility wasn't as abandoned as everyone had believed. She pushed the door fully open and stepped into the control room, her weapon drawn and her senses alert for any sign of movement. The space was larger than the blueprints had indicated, with additional equipment that definitely hadn't been part of the original chemical processing operation. In the center of the room sat a device that made the warehouse bomb look like a training exercise. The assembly covered an entire table, its components connected by a web of cables that ran to multiple power sources positioned around the room. Digital displays showed countdown timers, but instead of a single clock, there were 6 separate timing mechanisms, each counting down at different rates. Command, I have a visual on the device. This is significantly more complex than previous encounters. Multiple timing systems, extensive power distribution, and what appears to be remote monitoring capability. Riley approached the device cautiously, noting that the motion sensors she had encountered in the warehouse had been replaced by something that looked far more sophisticated. Laser detection grids created invisible barriers around the device, and pressure plates beneath the floor tiles would register any change in weight distribution. Checkmate, we're detecting unusual electronic signatures from your location, multiple active circuits that weren't there during our preliminary scans. Riley studied the device more closely and realized what she was looking at. This wasn't just a bomb, it was a testing facility. The multiple timers were set for different scenarios, allowing the device to be reconfigured for various difficulty levels. The remote monitoring equipment would record everything, providing detailed data on how she approached the problem. Command, this entire setup is designed for evaluation. Kozlov isn't trying to kill me. He's conducting a comprehensive assessment of my capabilities. Understood. Do you see any sign of Kozlov himself? Riley scanned the control room again, noting alcoves and equipment panels that could conceal a human observer. The facility's original design included maintenance spaces and monitoring positions that would allow someone to watch the main floor without being detected. Negative on visual contact, but there are multiple concealment positions. He could be anywhere in this facility. She began examining the bomb assembly, noting the sophisticated engineering that had gone into its construction. Each timer was connected to a different detonation pathway, and the explosive charges were positioned to create a progressive cascade that would test her ability to prioritize targets under pressure. Timer 1 showed 0847 and was connected to a small charge that would disable the facility's lighting systems. Timer 2 showed 0723 and controlled a larger charge that would seal the main exit routes. Timer 3, counting down from 615, was connected to the primary explosive array that would level the control room. But timers 4, 5, and 6 were counting down from much longer intervals, over 20 minutes each, and were connected to systems she couldn't immediately identify. Command, the device has 6 independent timing systems. 3 are short-term threats, 3 are long-term. I need to prioritize the immediate dangers first. Copy that. Overwatch teams report movement detected in the facility's lower levels. We may have company. Riley began working on Timer 3 first, since it represented the most immediate threat to her survival. The detonation mechanism was protected by multiple failsafes, but she recognized the design principles from her warehouse experience. Kozlov was using similar techniques, but with increased sophistication. As she traced the circuit pathways, her radio crackled with urgent updates from the surveillance teams. Multiple heat signatures moving through the facility basement level. Drone surveillance picking up vehicle movement approaching from the northeast. Jamming detected on backup communication frequencies. Riley realized that the situation had changed dramatically. This wasn't a controlled test with Kozlov observing from hiding. It was a full-scale operation with multiple participants and objectives she didn't understand. Command, request immediate extraction. This scenario is outside mission parameters. Agent Chen's voice carried a tension that hadn't been present during the briefing. Negative on extraction. Multiple unknown hostiles have surrounded the facility. You're safer inside until we can establish secure corridors. Timer 3 showed 4:32 when Riley heard footsteps on the metal staircase leading to the control room. Someone was approaching, and it wasn't one of Captain Reed's Rangers. Staff Sergeant Matthews? A voice called from the stairwell. The accent was definitely Eastern European, cultured but with an edge that suggested someone comfortable with violence. I believe you have something that belongs to me.
Riley positioned herself behind the control panels, using the bomb assembly as cover while keeping her weapon trained on the doorway. Viktor Kozlov, I presume. Indeed, though I must say, your reputation doesn't quite match your performance so far. I expected someone who disarmed my warehouse device to show more initiative. Kozlov stepped into the control room, and Riley was surprised by his appearance. Instead of the hardened mercenary she had expected, he looked like a university professor who happened to be carrying military-grade equipment. Mid-40s, average height, with the kind of calm demeanor that suggested he was completely comfortable in situations that would terrify normal people. The warehouse was a preliminary assessment, he continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the room while maintaining a respectful distance from both Riley and the bomb. This is the actual examination. What kind of examination? The kind that determines whether you're worth recruiting for a project that will reshape the global balance of power. Kozlov activated a tablet device that displayed real-time readouts from the bomb's monitoring systems. You have approximately 4 minutes to disarm the immediate threats, after which we can discuss more interesting opportunities. What kind of examination? The kind that determines whether you're worth recruiting for a project that will reshape the global balance of power. Kozlov activated a tablet device that displayed real-time readouts from the bomb's monitoring systems. You have approximately 4 minutes to disarm the immediate threats, after which we can discuss more interesting opportunities. Riley kept her weapon trained on Kozlov while simultaneously working on the Timer 3 circuit assembly. And if I refuse, then you'll have the distinction of being the first explosives expert to die from one of my devices through choice rather than inability. Timer 3 showed 0318 when Riley managed to isolate the primary detonation circuit. The design was elegant but followed logical principles that she could predict based on her warehouse experience. She cut the power feed to the explosive array and Timer 3's display went dark. "Excellent," Kozlov said, making notes on his tablet. "Now for the real challenge." Timer 2 showed 0247, but when Riley began examining its circuit assembly, she discovered that disarming Timer 3 had triggered additional complications. The system was designed to cascade, with each successful disarmament increasing the complexity of the remaining challenges. "You see, Staff Sergeant, I'm not interested in hiring people who can follow procedures under pressure. Any competent technician can do that with sufficient training. I need people who can innovate, who can solve problems that have never been encountered before." Riley traced the Timer 2 circuits and found that they were connected to systems throughout the facility, not just in the control room. Disarming this component would require her to leave the relative safety of her current position and access junction boxes in other parts of the building. "What makes you think I'm interested in whatever you're offering?" Kozlov smiled with the kind of confidence that suggested he knew something she didn't. "Because, Staff Sergeant Matthews, your military career is about to end whether you survive tonight or not." "Explain that." "Your participation in this operation has been unofficially sanctioned. The FBI believes they're running a sting operation to capture me, but they're actually providing me with an opportunity to evaluate you without interference from military command structures." Riley felt a cold realization spreading through her chest. "You're saying this is all a setup?" "I'm saying that Agent Chen and her team have been receiving intelligence from sources they believe are reliable, but which are actually feeding them information I want them to have. Your government thinks they're hunting me, when in reality they're delivering exactly what I need." Timer 2 showed 0153, and Riley had to make a decision. She could continue trying to disarm the device while questioning Kozlov's claims, or she could attempt to neutralize him directly and worry about the bomb afterward. "Even if that's true, I still have backup support outside this facility." "You mean Captain Reed's Rangers?" "They're currently dealing with a coordinated attack from mercenaries who have been planning this operation for weeks. Your extraction team is fighting for their own survival." Riley's radio had been silent for several minutes, which she had attributed to electronic interference from the facility's equipment. Now she realized it might be because there was no one left to provide updates. "You have 2 choices, Staff Sergeant. Disarm Timer 2 and prove that you're worth recruiting, or die here tonight along with everyone else who thought they could outsmart me." Timer 2 showed 0131 when Riley made her decision. She sprinted toward the control room exit, heading for the junction boxes that controlled Timer 2's circuit pathways. Behind her, she could hear Kozlov calling out encouragement like a teacher monitoring a particularly challenging exam. The next 90 seconds would determine not just whether she survived, but whether she would spend the rest of her life as Victor Kozlov's newest recruit or as another name on his list of victims. Either way, Riley Matthews was about to discover that everything she thought she knew about Operation Checkmate had been carefully orchestrated by the man she was supposed to help capture. Riley sprinted through the facility's maze of industrial equipment, her tactical flashlight cutting through the darkness as she searched for the junction boxes that controlled Timer 2's circuit pathways. Behind her, she could hear Kozlov's measured footsteps following at a distance that suggested he was confident about the outcome of this chase. The first junction box was located behind a bank of chemical storage tanks, its metal housing corroded by years of exposure to industrial vapors. Riley pried open the cover and found herself staring at a nightmare of rewired connections that bore no resemblance to the facility's original electrical schematics. Timer 2 showed 0107 when she began tracing the modified circuits. Kozlov had clearly spent weeks preparing this facility, replacing standard components with military-grade hardware and creating circuit pathways that would challenge even the most experienced explosives technician.
"You're thinking too conventionally, Staff Sergeant," Kozlov called from somewhere in the darkness. "This isn't a standard disarmament scenario. It's a test of creative problem-solving under extreme pressure." Riley ignored his commentary and focused on the wiring patterns. The circuits were designed to look chaotic, but she was beginning to recognize an underlying logic. Kozlov was testing her ability to see patterns in apparent randomness, to find elegant solutions to complex problems. She identified 3 primary circuit branches that fed power to Timer 2's detonation mechanism. The conventional approach would be to cut all 3 simultaneously. But the circuit design included fail-safes that would trigger if power was interrupted incorrectly. Instead of cutting wires, Riley began rerouting the circuits through bypass connections that would fool the fail-safe systems into believing the circuits were still intact. It was a technique she had learned during her original EOD training but had never used in practice. A theoretical solution to a theoretical problem that had suddenly become very real. "Innovative," Kozlov observed, now close enough that Riley could see his silhouette near the storage tanks. "Most people would have tried to cut their way through the problem. You're thinking like an engineer rather than a demolition expert." Timer 2 showed 034 when Riley completed the circuit rerouting. The display flickered once and went dark, leaving only Timer 1 still active at 028. "Excellent work. Now for the final component." Riley looked around the facility, trying to locate the junction box that controlled Timer 1. But Kozlov's voice stopped her before she could move. "Timer 1 doesn't have a junction box, Staff Sergeant. It's hardwired directly to the explosive assembly in the control room. You'll need to return there to complete the disarmament." Riley realized she had been maneuvered into exactly the position Kozlov wanted. The control room was a tactical disadvantage. Only one exit, limited cover, and no way to escape if something went wrong. But Timer 1's countdown was approaching critical levels, and she had no choice but to return. She sprinted back through the facility, taking the stairs 3 at a time, as Timer 1 continued its relentless countdown. Kozlov followed at his leisurely pace, apparently unconcerned about the explosion that would kill them both if she failed. The control room looked different when she burst through the doorway. Additional equipment had been activated while she was gone, and banks of monitors now displayed live feeds from surveillance cameras positioned throughout the facility. Riley could see tactical teams engaged in firefights at multiple locations around the perimeter, confirming Kozlov's claim that the backup support was compromised. Timer 1 was connected to the facility's primary explosive array, but the final disarmament sequence required simultaneously cutting 3 separate circuits while maintaining precise timing. A split-second delay would trigger the failsafe system and detonate the entire assembly. Riley positioned her tools around the 3 target circuits, calculating the hand movements necessary to make all 3 cuts within the required time window. She had practiced similar procedures during training, but never under conditions where failure meant immediate death. "Before you make those cuts," Kozlov said from the doorway, "perhaps you should know what you're really choosing between." Riley kept her hands positioned over the circuits but turned to face him. "What do you mean?"
Kozlov activated his tablet, and the control room monitors switched to display what appeared to be satellite imagery of military installations across the United States. Red markers indicated locations that Riley recognized as major EOD training facilities, ammunition depots, and strategic weapons storage sites. "The project I'm recruiting for," Kozlov explained with the calm tone of a university lecturer, "every facility you see marked on those maps will be simultaneously attacked by teams of specialists who understand military explosive protocols better than the people who designed them. You're planning to attack our own EOD capabilities? I'm planning to eliminate them entirely. The United States military's ability to deal with explosive threats will be crippled within a single coordinated operation. The people I've been recruiting aren't just bomb makers, they're former military specialists who know exactly how to target the systems they once protected. You're planning to attack our own EOD capabilities? I'm planning to eliminate them entirely. The United States military's ability to deal with explosive threats will be crippled within a single coordinated operation. The people I've been recruiting aren't just bomb makers, they're former military specialists who know exactly how to target the systems they once protected." Riley understood the full scope of what Kozlov was describing. Without functional EOD capabilities, the American military would be vulnerable to explosive attacks that could currently be neutralized. The strategic implications were staggering. "Join me, and you'll be part of reshaping global power structures. Refuse, and you'll die knowing that your death contributes nothing to stopping what's already in motion." Riley looked at the 3 circuits she needed to cut, then at the monitors showing Kozlov's planned targets, then back at timer 1. She made her choice. Instead of cutting the 3 circuits that would disarm timer 1, Riley grabbed her sidearm and put 3 rounds center mass into the facility's main power distribution panel. The control room plunged into darkness as every electrical system in the building shut down simultaneously. Timer 1's display went dark along with everything else. In the sudden silence that followed, Riley could hear Kozlov breathing heavily somewhere in the darkness. His carefully planned test had been disrupted by a solution he hadn't anticipated. Instead of playing by his rules, she had changed the game entirely. Emergency lighting flickered on after several seconds, casting eerie shadows across the control room. Kozlov stood near the doorway, no longer looking like a confident professor. For the first time since she had met him, he appeared genuinely surprised.
"Crude, but effective," he admitted. "Though you realize you've only delayed the inevitable. The bomb's backup power systems will restore timer 1 within approximately 60 seconds. Riley was already moving, using the temporary darkness to reposition herself closer to the explosive assembly. When the emergency lights revealed her new location, she was kneeling beside the bomb with her hands positioned over components that Kozlov couldn't see from his vantage point. "What are you doing?" "Something you didn't plan for." Riley had used the power interruption to physically disconnect the backup battery systems that would restore timer 1. Without power, the bomb was essentially inert. But she had also done something else during those crucial seconds in the darkness. She had activated the emergency beacon in her tactical gear, broadcasting her exact location to any friendly forces within range. You see, Victor, the one thing you didn't account for in your psychological profile was that some people are willing to sacrifice themselves to stop something they believe is wrong. Kozlov frowned, apparently trying to understand what she meant. Riley explained by holding up a small device she had removed from her gear pack. "This is a thermite charge designed for destroying sensitive equipment. I attached it to your bomb's primary explosive array while the lights were out." "You're bluffing. Detonating that charge would kill us both." "Yes, it would. But it would also destroy all the equipment you've used to monitor and record my responses. Your evaluation data, your recruitment assessment, your psychological profile, all of it would be destroyed." Kozlov's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching respect. "You would die to deny me information? I would die to protect the people you're planning to kill."
For several long moments, the two of them stared at each other across the darkened control room. Riley kept her thumb positioned over the thermite charge's activation switch, while Kozlov apparently weighed his options. The standoff was broken by the sound of helicopters approaching the facility. Through the control room windows, Riley could see searchlights cutting through the darkness and hear the distinctive sound of military rotors. "It appears your backup support was more resilient than my intelligence suggested." Riley's radio crackled back to life. "Checkmate, this is Eagle 1. We have visuals on the facility and are moving in for extraction. Maintain position." Captain Reed's voice had never sounded better to Riley. "Copy that, Eagle 1. Be advised, a hostile person is in the control room with me, along with explosive devices." "Understood. Tactical teams are securing the perimeter now." Kozlov listened to the radio chatter with apparent interest rather than concern. "Impressive coordination. Your Captain Reed managed to break through my mercenary teams faster than anticipated." "Give up, Victor. It's over." Kozlov smiled and activated his tablet one final time. The control room monitors displayed new images, not of military facilities, but of the faces Riley recognized from the task force briefing. Agent Chen, Lieutenant Colonel Washington, Dr. Kim, all of them marked with red targeting indicators. "Perhaps this operation is concluded, Staff Sergeant, but the larger project continues. Your colleagues made the mistake of becoming personally involved in hunting me. That makes them targets rather than obstacles." Riley felt a cold realization wash over her. Kozlov had never intended to recruit her. He had been using Operation Checkmate to identify and target the people most capable of stopping his real plan. The bomb, the test, all of this was just a way to draw out the specialists who might be able to stop you. Precisely. And now I know exactly who they are, where they work, and how they think. Tactical teams were moving through the facility now, their radio chatter indicating they were systematically clearing each floor. But Kozlov seemed unconcerned about his impending capture. "You're not planning to escape, are you?" Riley realized. "You're planning to get captured. I'm planning to be transferred to a federal facility where I'll have access to the kinds of intelligence databases that will make targeting my enemies much more efficient." Riley understood that even capturing Kozlov wouldn't stop his plan. It would actually advance it by giving him access to federal resources and classified information about American EOD capabilities. The sound of tactical boots on metal stairs indicated that Captain Reed's teams were approaching the control room. Riley had perhaps 30 seconds before they arrived. 30 seconds to decide whether to let Kozlov be captured according to his plan, or to take action that would prevent him from accessing federal databases. She looked at the thermite charge in her hand, then at Kozlov, then at the bomb assembly that contained months of research and planning. "You know, Victor, there's one more thing you didn't account for in your psychological assessment." "Which is?" Riley activated the thermite charge. "Sometimes the only way to win is to make sure nobody does." The explosion lit up the control room like a miniature sun, destroying not just the bomb assembly, but every piece of electronic equipment Kozlov had brought to the facility. The blast was contained enough that it didn't bring down the building, but comprehensive enough that it turned months of research and planning into molten metal and smoke. When Captain Reed's tactical team burst into the control room 30 seconds later, they found Riley unconscious but alive near the doorway, and Victor Kozlov sitting against the far wall with an expression of something that might have been admiration. "You know," he said to the Rangers as they secured his hands with zip ties, "she might have been worth recruiting after all." Riley woke up 3 days later in a military hospital outside Phoenix, her body aching from the concussion blast, but her mind clear enough to understand what had happened. Agent Chen was sitting in a chair beside her bed, looking like she hadn't slept since the operation. "How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a truck. What's Kozlov's status?" "Federal custody, maximum security, no access to outside communications or databases. Your thermite charge destroyed enough of his equipment that we were able to capture him without giving him access to the intelligence he was seeking." Riley nodded, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind.
The other targets on his list, the EOD facilities? Safe. Without the intelligence he was gathering about our capabilities and personnel, his network couldn't coordinate the attacks he had planned. Agent Chen leaned forward in her chair. Riley, what you did in that control room, choosing to destroy the equipment rather than disarm the bomb conventionally, that wasn't part of any training manual. No, it wasn't. So what made you think of it? Riley considered the question, remembering the moment when she had realized that following Kozlov's rules would only lead to his victory, regardless of whether she survived the immediate test. I guess I learned that sometimes the best way to handle pressure isn't to do what everyone expects. Sometimes you have to break the rules entirely. Agent Chen smiled. Well, for what it's worth, your psychological evaluation has been updated. Turns out you handle pressure just fine. You just handle it differently than anyone expected. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Riley Matthews was promoted to Sergeant First Class and assigned to lead a new EOD training program focused on unconventional problem-solving under extreme pressure. Her first class included experienced bomb technicians from across the military who were being retrained to think beyond standard protocols. The program was called Adaptive Response Training, but the students had their own name for it. They called it the 90-second solution, in honor of the time it had taken their instructor to prove that sometimes the impossible was just another word for not yet solved. And every new class began with the same lesson. When someone tells you that you can't handle pressure, the best response isn't to prove them wrong, it's to redefine what handling pressure actually means. 2 years after the Westfield incident, Sergeant First Class Riley Matthews stood before a congressional hearing room packed with military officials, federal agents, and politicians who had spent months trying to understand how a single bomb disposal operation had prevented what intelligence agencies were calling the most sophisticated terrorist plot in American history. The mahogany-paneled chamber felt more intimidating than any explosive device Riley had ever faced. Senator Patricia Hawkins, the committee chairwoman, reviewed her notes before addressing Riley directly. Sergeant Matthews, intelligence reports indicate that Viktor Kozlov's network had successfully recruited 12 former military explosives experts across 7 countries. Without the information you destroyed at Westfield, they were unable to coordinate simultaneous attacks on 43 military installations. Can you walk us through your decision-making process during those final moments? Riley adjusted her dress uniform and considered how to explain split-second decisions to people who had never faced life-or-death situations. Senator, conventional bomb disposal training teaches systematic approaches to known problems, but Kozlov's test wasn't designed to have a conventional solution. Elaborate on that. Every action he expected me to take would have given him strategic intelligence about American EOD capabilities. Disarming his bomb correctly would have demonstrated our training methods, response times, and technical limitations. Failing to disarm it would have eliminated someone he viewed as a potential threat to his operations. Congressman Michael Torres leaned forward. So you chose a third option that he hadn't anticipated? I chose to deny him any useful intelligence, even if it meant risking both our lives. Senator Hawkins consulted another document. The psychological evaluation conducted after your capture states that you demonstrated exceptional stress tolerance and innovative problem-solving under extreme pressure. This is quite different from your original EOD assessment 18 months earlier. Riley had anticipated this question. The story of her transformation from failed EOD candidate to the soldier who stopped an international conspiracy had become something of a legend within military circles, but she knew the real explanation was more complex than the heroic narrative that had emerged. Senator, pressure doesn't create character, it reveals it. My original EOD failure wasn't about lacking stress tolerance. It was about being trained to follow procedures in situations that required breaking them. Can you explain the difference? Riley thought about the hundreds of soldiers she had trained over the past 2 years, each of them struggling with the same fundamental challenge that had once defeated her. Traditional explosive ordnance disposal relies on systematic approaches because most bombs follow predictable patterns, but sophisticated adversaries like Kozlov designed their devices specifically to punish systematic thinking. So your training program teaches soldiers to abandon established protocols? No, ma'am. It teaches them to recognize when established protocols are being used against them and how to develop alternative solutions under time pressure. The committee members exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely comfortable with the implications of what Riley was describing. Congressman Torres spoke next. Sergeant Matthews, we've received reports that your adaptive response training program has produced some unconventional results. Can you address concerns about soldiers who might interpret your teaching as permission to disregard military discipline? Riley had been expecting this challenge as well. Her training program had indeed produced soldiers who were more willing to question orders and improvise solutions, which had made some traditional commanders uncomfortable. Congressman, the soldiers in my program learned to distinguish between tactical flexibility and disciplinary breakdown. We're not teaching them to disobey orders. We're teaching them to accomplish mission objectives when standard procedures prove inadequate. She gestured to a folder of reports she had brought to the hearing. Every graduate of the Adaptive Response Program has maintained exemplary disciplinary records while demonstrating significantly improved performance in high-stress scenarios. Senator Hawkins opened her own copy of the folder. These performance metrics are impressive, but they also raise questions about whether our traditional training methods are adequate for modern threats. That's exactly the question we should be asking, Senator. Kozlov's network wasn't defeated by superior firepower or better technology. It was stopped by someone who was willing to think beyond the parameters that our enemies had studied and planned for. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the committee's military psychology consultant, spoke for the first time. Sergeant Matthews, your psychological profile indicates a significant change in how you process stress and uncertainty. Can you describe what changed between your initial EOD failure and your success at Westfield? Riley considered the question carefully. The real answer involved months of self-doubt, gradual confidence building, and the kind of personal growth that couldn't be easily quantified in military reports. Dr. Chen, I learned that my original approach to pressure was based on trying to control outcomes rather than controlling my response to uncertainty. When I stopped trying to guarantee success and started focusing on adaptive problem solving, I became more effective under pressure. That's a significant psychological shift. How do you teach that to other soldiers? By creating training scenarios where conventional solutions fail and students have to develop creative alternatives. We call them impossible problems, challenges that can only be solved by changing the assumptions built into the problem itself. Senator Hawkins reviewed another document. Speaking of changing assumptions, intelligence reports indicate that Viktor Kozlov has continued to operate from federal prison. He's been providing information about international terrorist networks in exchange for certain privileges. How do you feel about that arrangement? Riley felt her jaw tighten. The idea that Kozlov was still influencing operations from behind bars had been a source of frustration for months, but she understood the strategic value of the intelligence he provided. Senator, Kozlov is a strategic thinker who plays long-term games. Any information he provides should be considered potentially compromised or designed to serve his larger objectives. Are you suggesting we shouldn't trust intelligence from a captured terrorist? I'm suggesting that someone who spent years staying ahead of international law enforcement agencies doesn't suddenly become trustworthy because he's in federal custody. Congressman Torres pulled out a classified report that had been heavily redacted. Recent intelligence gathered through Kozlov's cooperation has prevented at least 6 terrorist attacks across 3 countries. Doesn't that suggest his information is reliable? Riley studied the congressman's expression, noting the kind of political calculation that suggested he was more interested in justifying existing policies than examining their effectiveness. Congressman, preventing 6 attacks while potentially enabling a 7th, larger attack isn't necessarily a victory. Kozlov thinks strategically. Any information he provides serves his long-term objectives. What evidence do you have that he's pursuing long-term objectives from prison? Riley opened her briefing folder and pulled out photographs that had been classified until the previous week.
These images show modifications to Kozlov's prison cell that weren't authorized by federal corrections officials. Electronic equipment, communication devices, and what appears to be bomb-making components disguised as personal effects. The committee members leaned forward to examine the photographs, their expressions shifting from skeptical to concerned as they absorbed the implications. "Where did you obtain these images?" Senator Hawkins asked. "From federal agents who requested my assistance in analyzing the devices. Kozlov has been using his cell as a laboratory to develop new explosive technologies, which he's been sharing with contacts outside the prison." Dr. Chen studied the photographs more closely. How is he getting these materials into a maximum security facility? The same way he obtained intelligence about Operation Checkmate before we captured him. Kozlov has infiltrated federal systems at levels we're still trying to understand. The hearing room fell silent as the committee members absorbed this information. Riley could see them grappling with the possibility that their prize intelligence asset was actually still conducting terrorist operations from inside their most secure prison. Congressman Torres broke the silence. "Sergeant Matthews, what would you recommend regarding Kozlov's current status?" Riley had spent months considering this exact question, weighing the strategic value of Kozlov's intelligence against the risks of keeping him alive and operational. Complete isolation from all electronic devices, communication systems, and materials that could be used for weapons development. Any intelligence he provides should be considered compromised until independently verified through other sources. That would significantly reduce the value of his cooperation. It would also significantly reduce the risk that he's using that cooperation to advance his original objectives. Senator Hawkins consulted her watch and realized the hearing had run over its scheduled time. "Sergeant Matthews, before we conclude, is there anything else the committee should know about the ongoing threat assessment?" Riley had been hoping for this opportunity to address her primary concern about the current approach to combating sophisticated terrorist networks. "Senator, the greatest threat we face isn't individual terrorists like Kozlov. It's our tendency to respond to sophisticated adversaries using conventional methods that they've already studied and plan to counter." Explain. Kozlov succeeded for years because he understood how military and law enforcement agencies operate. He planned his attacks around our standard procedures, our communication protocols, our organizational structures. The only reason we stopped him was by doing something he hadn't planned for. Riley gestured to the photographs of Kozlov's prison laboratory. If he's still developing new technologies and sharing them with international networks, it's because we're still thinking conventionally about unconventional threats. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "You're suggesting that our institutional responses to terrorism need to become more adaptive. I'm suggesting that in a conflict between conventional institutions and adaptive adversaries, the adaptive adversaries usually win, unless the institutions learn to think differently." Senator Hawkins made final notes before addressing Riley directly. "Sergeant Matthews, this committee will be making recommendations about both your training program and our approach to high-value terrorist prisoners. Your testimony has been invaluable." "Thank you, Senator. I hope the committee will consider that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who force us to evolve our capabilities." As Riley left the hearing room, she reflected on how much had changed since her first encounter with one of Kozlov's devices in a Phoenix warehouse. The frightened soldier who had frozen during EOD training had become someone who could testify before Congress about strategic threats and institutional adaptation. But the real measure of her transformation wasn't the recognition or the promotions. It was the knowledge that hundreds of soldiers now approach impossible problems with the confidence that conventional solutions weren't the only options available. 3 weeks later, Riley received orders transferring her to a new assignment at the Pentagon, where she would be developing training protocols for special operations forces facing unconventional threats worldwide. The Adaptive Response Program would be expanded to include not just explosive ordnance disposal, but any military specialty that required innovative thinking under extreme pressure. Her first briefing at the Pentagon included intelligence reports from international sources confirming that Kozlov's prison laboratory had been dismantled and his communication privileges permanently revoked. The congressional hearing had resulted in significant changes to how high-value prisoners were managed and monitored. But Riley knew that Kozlov was just one example of the kind of sophisticated adversary that military forces would face in the future. The real victory wasn't capturing any individual terrorist. It was developing institutional capabilities that could adapt faster than the threats they faced. On her last day at Camp Meridian, Riley stood in the same desert training facility where she had rebuilt her confidence after her EOD failure. The obstacle course looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. She was no longer the soldier who had been told she couldn't handle pressure. She was the soldier who had redefined what handling pressure actually meant. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of her replacement conducting training exercises with a new group of students, teaching them that the most important lesson in military service wasn't learning to follow procedures under pressure. It was learning when to break them. The story that had begun with 90 seconds in a Phoenix warehouse had become a new chapter in how the United States military prepared for threats that hadn't been invented yet. And every time a soldier solved an impossible problem by changing the rules instead of accepting defeat, Riley Matthews had won that battle all over again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.